Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Good Guys. Today we have a lighthearted topic. Before that, I would like to mention a few things. We made a video, but I decided not to re record that video. Instead, I'm going to briefly talk about my own opinion on Christianity. And that is, I think that Michael Heiser, Heiser, John Bear, Behr, Origin of Alexandria, are good interpreters of Holy Scriptures. Now, of course, the libertarian position is your own salvation is your personal individual thing. What is relevant in the world of daily life, of ordinary human activity and interaction, is morality, how you behave towards others. And of course, if you are a parent, you know what your responsibilities are. However, based and building on our most recent video, let's not virtue signal too much about how pious or good we are. Let's not become preachy to the choir of people who are already in agreement with the fundamentals. But let's think about the progress and constructions that we need to cooperate towards. With that, today we'll be talking about the moral progress of humanity, namely regarding the topic of cannibalism.
The essay of today is called Progression of Morality, Cannibalism, Slavery, and the State. Both the highly pessimistic as the highly optimistic people lack an insight regarding the characteristics of development of morality. First, the highly optimistic people believe human beings can change quite instantly and can become more moral, analogous to the development of the technology. The highly pessimistic people state that human beings are what they are and don't see any real development. The Paleolithic human being is as moral as the postmodern human being. The only development is technological development. The pessimists have a great point. Human beings are not much different from the Paleolithic human beings. We just have more tools. And with our culture, religion, education, and upbringing, human beings are likely to fall in the moral state of the Paleolithic era again. And there is good reason there's no good reason to romanticize the circumstances of the Paleolithic era. Yes, the rivers had clean water. The anthropogenic air pollution was, despite wood being the main fuel, quite low, since the human population as a whole wasn't a big crowd yet. Plants, and thus also the vegetables and fruits, were all organic. There was no or almost no obesity. Infant mortality was high. People died of nowadays incurable infectious diseases or from starvation due to a food shortage, or they were killed by wild animals. It is estimated that on average, on a yearly basis, 1% to 40% of the population died of interhuman violence. That means at least 2 times as more violence than a permanent Second World War death toll. And take notice, that includes the Holocaust, the atomic bombs and bombardments of cities, and the armies hitting each other with advanced tools compared with people of the Stone Age with spears, sticks, rocks, and bare hands. Let's take the relatively low estimate of 1% and not the 15% of Stephen Pinker to please Rutger Bregman with his homo puppy thesis. That means 1,000 murders per 100,000 people a year. To compare this with the current era, in the most murderous country, the Turks and Caicos Islands, on a yearly basis, 77 people per 100,000 people get murdered, and in the most murderous city in the world, Colima in Mexico, on a yearly basis, 182 people per 100,000 inhabitants are killed. So the most murderous country is only 7.7% as murderous as the whole world in the Paleolithic era, and the most murderous city is somewhat more than 1/6 as murderous as the world in the Paleolithic era, according to one of the lowest estimates in a scientific study. Even if we take in account that with modern medicine, less people die from wounds and infections caused by wounds, most people would have died, and in other eras, this day and age, with biologically more or less the same human beings, strikingly less violent than the Paleolithic era. Singapore has an annual murder rate of 0.07 per 100,000 inhabitants, meaning that according to the low estimate we used for comparison, the Paleolithic era was over 14,000 times as deadly violent as Singapore. Despite human nature hasn't changed, despite human beings being capable to the most terrifying atrocities in certain circumstances, and despite systematic punishment of criminals, there seems to be a progress in human morality without any biological change. First of all, the rule of law. Murderers get punished. Many religions forbid murder, and there are a lot of more goods and services. There is a lot less scarcity, and we can store food for as long, which causes the time preference to drop. So it is twofold. The morality has changed due to the religious dogmas and cultural norms, and the circumstances to make survival and even thriving possible, holding the moral standard not to kill someone are there. Not only it makes a difference if your religion or cultural norms forbids you to kill or encourage you to kill, it is also of big importance if survival is easier and not harder if you don't kill someone. That is why we can't separate technological development from something as primitive as planting seeds you found during hunting near home to the most advanced computers from the development of morality. To give an example, anthropophagy that implied the death of a human being is by far more tempting in an ecology with extreme scarcity than in an environment of superabundance. Of course, it is not only superabundance that ended cannibalism. Cannibalistic tribes in the modern era usually didn't need the dead bodies of their fellow men as food, but had cultivated cannibalism as a ritual that marked the ultimate defeat and humiliation of their enemy tribes. Survival cannibalism and cultural cannibalism. You need both superabundance and exchange of culture. Slavery and the Industrial Revolution. The reason why slavery was abolished by Western countries in the second part of the 19th century was not only a development regarding ethics. The Industrial Revolution ended the Malthusian trap. For the first time, explosive economic growth and population growth at the same time became possible. From antiquity on to the 18th century, the economic growth led to population growth, and population growth led to economic stagnation. For thousands of years, there was a near zero growth. The living standards in antiquity weren't much different from the living standards in the early modern era. This changed with the Industrial Revolution, starting in Great Britain in the second part of the 18th century, when the production methods became more efficient than ever before. The Industrial Revolution could become successful because of the second agricultural revolution that already had started in the 17th century in northwestern Europe. The agricultural output grew faster than the population. A few elements changed the character of agriculture dramatically in the 16th and 17th century. First of all, the introduction of the potato in Europe by Spain. It turned out that the potato could be cultivated quite easily on European soil, including the more cold areas, and the potato was also very nutritious, with more calories than the root vegetables native to Europe. The population of European Spain grew from 6.5 million people in 1500 to 8.5 million people in 1600, despite the plagues, wars, and the immigration overseas, mainly to the Americas. In the year 1513, the Spaniard Gabriel Alonso de Herrera published the book Obra de Agricultura, Treatise of Agriculture, financed by Cardinal Cisneros, which would become an influential standard work of agriculture. Spain also introduced guano in Europe, a fertilizer based on the feces of birds and bats, and used for centuries in the coastal area of Peru, and more effective than the feces of cattle. In the Netherlands, the agricultural output per laborer rose by 80% in the 16th and 17th century, leading to a decline of 60% in manpower in the agricultural sector by 1650. One of the contributing factors was the invention of the light plough, making it possible to get more work done in less time, and their version of the Chinese iron plough in the first half of the 17th century. The agricultural boom was one of the elements why their golden age could become possible and could be sustained. Another factor was the introduction of crop rotation instead of fallow farming, which meant that more acres of soil could be used more efficiently, in contrast with the earlier habit to leave a part of the land fallow. Farmers grew more products on more of their land at the same time, planted crops that could be grown in the winter, and plants that had a function as a natural fertilizer. An important crop rotation method was the Norfolk four-course system, or four-field system, that was developed in Flanders in the 16th century and popularized in Great Britain in the early 18th century. They rotated wheat, turnips, barley, and clover. With this system, it became possible to produce both agricultural products for human consumption, grain to make bread, and fodder, allowing livestock to breed year-round and to keep more animals for breeding. With more animals alive, there were also more animal feces and therefore more fertilizer. Before the invention of the Norfolk four-course system, most animals were slaughtered before the winter because there was not enough food for them. The agricultural productivity per laborer more than doubled. That made the Industrial Revolution possible. Less agricultural laborers were needed, and thus more could work in another sector. The growing population in Great Britain was also a factor to make the Industrial Revolution a success. With the growing population and still more agricultural output to sustain the population, there was also a need to provide clothes for the population. That is why the first industrial manufacturers often were specialized in textiles. And because of the economic growth, along with population growth, there was more capital to hire personnel and there were more people in the labor force. That made it easy to employ people and contractual labor quite cheap. Because contractual labor became cheap, slavery became, to a growing extent, by comparison, more expensive. And with slavery becoming more expensive, it became less profitable, and therefore the incentive to become a slave owner or slave driver dropped. Someone who wants to understand the North-South division in the USA of the mid-19th century has to understand that the North, that was mostly the northeastern area, was becoming industrialized, making slavery redundant. It is this redundancy that makes space for the support of the abolition movement, not some sudden moral insight. Creative destruction and statism. Internet undermines traditional media. Internet is a threat for newspapers, magazines, television, and radio. The information is almost free on the internet. Journalists and editorials as middlemen are in most cases redundant and do in most cases a worse job as compared with unprofessional locals with a smartphone. Let's say that there is a flood somewhere or a volcano starts erupting unexpectedly. A local with a smartphone will not only be the first to report the fact, but will in general also do a better job in reporting the news. He or she is the first at the place where the news is, has first-hand footage, he knows the locals, and he can publish the footage first. Local amateur journalists can collect more easily the stories and facts. A traditional newspaper has to ask the correspondent in the area to follow the local news to make a story out of it. With the internet, every person with a smartphone and an internet connection has access to the same information as any traditional journalist, and even for a resuming story, you will be able to find content for free on the internet. Newspapers, magazines, television, and radio become overpriced and of less quality than quite cheaply produced content of websites, video sites like YouTube and BitChute, podcasts, and social media. A good example of the creative destruction mentioned by Joseph Schumpeter. Courses online undermine state education. Information-wise, the free books and free courses online are superior to the expensive education in physical spaces like classrooms and even most universities. Professor Huerta de Soto, for example, has entire economy courses online for free, and those courses have a higher quality than the expensive economy courses in physical academia. So it is cheaper, it is better, it is easier to access. You don't have to incur debt, you don't have to travel for it, and also relatively poor people with a second-hand cheap smartphone and a Wi-Fi connection can participate. Creative destruction is key. Internet destroys traditional media, the traditional music industry, and traditional education. Uber destroys the traditional taxi branch. Airbnb destroys the traditional hotel and motel branch. Cryptos undermine fiat currencies. 3D printing decentralizes security, even in countries where firearms are outlawed. And for fear of drowning into non-existence, the mostly redundant and obsolete sectors often demand regulation and subsidies to counter the services that are replacing them. They are like horse and carriage owners who want to sabotage automobiles, candle manufacturers who want an end to the light bulb, air balloon owners who want to tax and regulate airline companies, copyists who want to stop book printing, farmers who apply the two-field or three-field system who demand regulations to stop the farmers who apply the normal four-core system, slave drivers who demand an end to the industrial revolution because it leads to a big contractual labor market, politicians who want the destruction of creative destruction in the market that is a threat for their central plan. How to overcome the state like we overcame cannibalism and slavery. Two main elements: creative destruction in a new structure that is able to sustain the alternative. You still have to preach during a famine that cannibalism is wrong. But if you are serious about ending cannibalism, you should promote efficient methods to produce food. One can have the best arguments why slavery is wrong. If voluntary labor outcompetes slavery, slavery will disappear. People can have the conviction that education must be cheap and accessible for the poor masses, but without the mass application of inventions like the internet and cheap computers and cheap smartphone, it is just a vain wish. There has to be an alternative if you have a wish to end child labor. Often people think in a simplistic way about it and have the statement that children need education, not labor. Well, the reason why children work is because education is expensive, while their income is needed in their family. Giving to charity is not a solution. It will lead to dependency and it doesn't solve the problem. Overcoming the economic phase of child labor is the solution. Child labor didn't disappear in Western Europe because of charity or because of laws. The legislation that outlawed child labor couldn't be implemented before their time without terrible undesired consequences. If you should outlaw child labor in a country where families with members with skills that are much valued in the labor market, the consequences can be illegal child labor with worse circumstances. Where sewing workshops have to fire their children, brothels and bricklaying businesses are often an alternative. Economic improvement, skill improvement, and cheaper education will do more to end the misery of child labor than any legislation and charity. People who are serious about ending child labor should focus on economic improvement, skill improvement, and cheaper education rather than legislation and charity, and even abandon legislation and charity because of the undesired consequences. Abundance of goods and services will do more for our case than spreading utilitarian, consequentialist, and moral insights, even though these insights are vital. For a real change, holding a moral norm alone is not decisive. The ethics have to fall on fertile ground. Just like cannibalism, slavery, and child labor ended in most parts of the world, now we are on the threshold of abolishing state media and state education because there are good alternatives. After abolishing public media and public education, other sectors with government involvement need to emancipate themselves from statism. The production of safety, for example, will, when done well, show the inferiority of the service produced by the government. Even people who understand the ethics of non-aggression and have the insight that a monopoly backed by guns is not a good idea are reluctant to advocate abolishing the service of producing safety by the government because they don't see any alternative, nor do they have an idea about an alternative that is linked to the current private security. As soon private security does visibly a better job for less money and without initiating force, the monopoly to initiate force will lose its support dramatically. Just like cannibalism and slavery, it will become an aberration, something that, though it still exists in some places, is completely discredited and associated with a barbaric past.
Yes, the first thing that I want to mention is the difference that you make at the beginning in terms of the moral norms of different religions. Because Spain comes after 7 centuries of fighting the Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula along with Portugal. And as a consequence of that, the Battle of Granada in 1492, it is that the reunification of all the Christian kingdoms of Spain lead to the seafaring voyages and the discovery of the Americas, which then lead to the conquest of the Inca Empire and of the Aztec Empire, who practiced human
Sacrifices.
sacrifice. And here you see the realism of that line of the complete version of the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States, where it says, then we can conquer because our cause is just. In the case of Spain, Spain and the Christian crown of Castile Aragon was closer to freedom, to liberty, and to non-aggression than the human sacrifice of the Aztec Empire. For example, the Aztecs would take the enemies, tie them to a post, and eat them bit by bit, starting by the thighs. And they would go to the pyramid in the public square of Tenochtitlan and take out the heart and eat it of a living person.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Also, the way they kept prisoners of war, they kept prisoners of war to be sacrificed, which is very different from the Convention of Geneva.
And of course, these are not hunter-gatherer civilizations. These were agricultural civilizations.
And
that were
quite developed civilizations.
That were doing this with great cruelty. It was stopped by Spain, that also stopped the progress of the Al-Andalus after the fall of the Roman Empire. And as a consequence of that, then you saw the introduction of the potato to Europe, and in the long run, the Industrial Revolution. So freedom is not free. Freedom has a risk. Freedom has a cost also in virtue and courage. But I think that this essay speaks for itself.